Brian Baker says, what is your biggest motivation for creating? I don't mean money, I mean what emotional and creative feeling makes you want to create? Bookmark that question. And then we go to Jay Blanyon, who says, recently you mentioned writing an article about making, and that pivotal, though not guaranteed moment when the object being made seems to come alive, communicating its wants and needs to the maker. I couldn't find the article, but the idea resonated with me. Could you expand on it? To me, it feels like the most magical part of making. Magic is a perfect word for this. And I'm interested here in attempting to talk clinically about creativity and its immediate and personal, emotional, and mental rewards. And not even sure where to begin, so bear with me here. We're talking about, when we're talking about creativity and making, we're talking about more than just taking an object and making another one just like that object, even though that is a large portion of what I execute here in the cave. And I don't exclude that from this discussion, but I mean this much more in a sort of an art way, in the way you classically, culturally think about making a piece of art, i.e. making a piece of communication that represents a self or a point of view from a self. Okay. I'm just going to describe my experience of it. And I've got an object here to show you. So this piece is, how old is this piece? 1987. So it's 38 years old, 39 years old. I made this in Brooklyn, in Park Slope, in my apartment just off of Prospect Park on Carroll Street. And a friend of mine had written a poem, and in the poem, he had this line, and the line from the poem was, "She showed me my face in the water of faces beneath her body." Just that line was in this poem. She showed me my face in the water of faces beneath my body. I still find that line ludicrously compelling. And the moment I heard that, I started ringing the phrase "water of faces" in my head. It just was like a steady drum beat. So it's 1987, I'm 20, and I'm sitting there in my apartment in Brooklyn thinking water of faces, water of faces. And I had just discovered plaster bandages, and I'd made this cast of my face. And I also, in coming home from Brooklyn, I'd gotten off at the subway stop, and there was like a medical equipment company throwing a bunch of stuff out, and I pulled like 20 pounds of this kind of crap out of their dumpster. And I was sitting there in my apartment, and I was just thinking water of faces, and I started to put this together, and it took a few hours. It might have been a day or two. And then this came out. And this piece really, this piece is still not done, and it still surprises me almost 40 years later. I actually was so sort of surprised by it when it came out of my workbench that I called my dad, and I was like, hey, I want to come up to Tarrytown and see you guys. I've got something I want to show you. And I brought this with me, and I was just like, look, this just happened, and I wanted to show it to you. And my dad had this great thing to say. I love this phrase. He said, what I like about this, he said, is that it brings its own morality to it. Now, that's a big phrase, and I'm still in some ways in my head working out what that means to me on a creative, aesthetic, execution level. But what I can tell you is that that process of thinking about something that I can't stop thinking about and using that thought as an impetus to put my hands into motion to make a thing has, in the course of my life, yielded many, many, many objects that surprise me. what about this should surprise me? I built this. I made all of these creative decisions. So why, when I look at it, does it still surprise me? And that, Brian Baker, is why I make. Because 1 + 1 = 5 here. 1 + 1 = 1,000,000, as Tom Sachs likes to say. Something happens in the alchemy of me using my experience and my point of view and my skills and my talent at the time to execute an idea that's banging around in here. And when I do that, the thing that comes out of that, it does feel alive to me. It changes over time. I've been carrying this thing around for 40 years. That's like 6 or 7, 8 different apartments between then and now. 2, 3 different cities. And yet, like, this thing is still important enough I keep it on a shelf because I'm still in a way learning from it. I'm learning about my own aesthetics from this, from something that happened to my head 40 years ago. So, Jay Blandon, you're asking about the object seeming to come alive. I'm not going to assert that there's any like sentience or real sort of, spirit going on here, because I don't think that there is. But I do think Einstein once said that my belief in God is all the things I don't know about the universe. That's where he saw God. Like, this was a person who parsed a tremendous amount of the world by himself and on the shoulders of giants, both, and described their feeling of omnipotence as the list of things that are unknowable, which I love. And this falls into that category for me. Because the things I have made over my life have taught me so much and in so many different ways, and they have different lessons depending upon the period of my life that I'm engaging with them. So they change over time, to me. And there are many pieces in this building that have also changed over time. So to me, that is a bit of a kind of a life. There is something alive in that intersection. And then I'll go to a much more recent construction that you all got to kind of witness happening, which is my lightsaber. So I was looking around for objects that were like, came totally out of me, totally from my own idea. And this is one that, frankly, every time I look down and see this on the shelf, I'm like, love that thing. So happy with that thing. And that's why I make, because there's more to, like, if it was just, I make a thing, I like that thing, I still like that thing. That's like linear. But what really happens is I make a thing, I like that thing. A few months later, wow, I really like that thing. A few years later, whoa, I'm learning some things about myself based on what I did back then that I didn't even know back then. That's real. And that's my experience with the sort of a universal unknown. That exploration of using my skills to execute something that is important to me and I'm not exactly sure why, just every bit of attention I have paid to that space has yielded benefits to me, creatively, emotionally, interpersonally, professionally. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So I'd like to finish with a kind of, if I could possibly give any guidance to someone listening who hasn't experienced this and is like, I want some of that, I would say that personally, I don't think there's a difference between crafting and art. I think they are just two descriptions for parts of a process. And I would say that one leads to the other, because when you get good enough at executing on one level, you start to be able to zoom out and see wider. You get good enough at quilting or crocheting or sewing. I'm all cloth fabric based. I don't know why, but you get good at jewelry making and pottery. At a certain point, you stop becoming concerned with all the parameters and you start to be like zooming out on your craft, on your skill, on your execution. And when you're zooming out, these thoughts start to occur of like, hey, what if I put a blue stripe there? And there will always be this part of you that's like, I don't know where that came from. That's why I make. I don't know where that came from. I don't know what about my point of view knew to do that. That's another thing, is when a piece is really good, I often have very little memory of the set of decisions that made it. Like, it feels to me like a magic trick. Okay, so from the sacred to the profane, I just want to also get this one in. Leon Krug just finished an architecture degree and started working at a prestigious architecture firm. And even after a couple of months is already disappointed by the architecture world, and the experimentation that they loved in university is being shelved, and they're grinding out quote unquote bullshit buildings. How do you deal with the disillusionment between what you know something could be versus what it actually is? Well, dude, that's commerce right there. Like, the reason that Mythbusters ended up doing an episode about turd polishing, about whether you could polish a turd, is specifically because in special effects, you're almost always working on a bad movie. Just on the aggregate, most movies are bad, few of them are good. It's unlikely that you're always working on the good ones. And when you're working on a bad movie, you're still putting in all your skill, all your passion, all your talent to make the thing good for your art director or your supervisor. And we called that turd polishing. And there is, like, look, you know, that's part of dues paying, is grinding out that tedious work of what you're calling bullshit buildings. Like, most of the world, most of the made world is that. And if you are, in my experience, if you are really good at that part, you get really good at that part, you can carve out for yourself 15 to 20% of the time that you do some fun stuff, good stuff, interesting stuff, creative stuff, challenging stuff. But you've got to get good at the tedium. We just put up the ELF elevator build, and man, I'm going to actually sing my own praises here. I'm just so happy with the way I talk about tedium in that video, because it hadn't occurred to me before I shot that video that tedium isn't just a requirement for doing certain kinds of work. In fact, tedium is the job for certain kinds of work. And architecture is absolutely one of those, right? There's a lot of T's to cross and I's to dot. And I would say that, you know, if you still love the experimentation and the form, the creative form of architecture, you hold on to that and you do your own stuff on the side while you're grinding out the tedious stuff for commerce, for work, with an eye towards how do you get to the place where you can start executing and playing with those experimental ideas. And if the prestigious firm you're working for is way far from your goals, you might consider interviewing at some others to look for different kinds of supportive environments. But that's commerce, man. Most of commerce means you're going to be grinding out stuff that you don't think is that great, really. That's like late stage capitalism. And that's how I like to prepare young people who want to get into special effects. I'm like, if you want to get into special effects, you got to be able to drill like 1,000 holes without complaint, all in the right place, and not mess one of them up. Like, that's really mission critical. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I wanted to briefly mention that you could become a tested member. I know, everybody is competing for you to become a member of their thing. What I want to express to you is that the Tested membership has become such an important part of the Tested family. We get tremendous feedback from the Tested members, and they expand the stories that we can tell and the things that we have access to, and you can become a part of it right now by clicking on the link below. See you in the chat.